Welcome back, everybody, and welcome back to my channel, and welcome back to Talking History. And if you haven't done so already, please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to my channel and also the podcast. I really appreciate it. As I keep saying, this podcast is available on YouTube, but it's also available on Spotify and Amazon Music, and it's open to any historians, scholars of any other topics, any other disciplines, or just history buffs in general. But today we'll have another very special guest on, folks, and we'll have Dr. Tim Galsworthy, and he's a lecturer in history and military history in particular, and it's at Lincoln Bishop University. And today Tim is going to be discussing his new book, which is absolutely amazing, The Republican House Divided, Civil War Memory, Civil Rights, and the Transformation of the GOP. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to Tim, who's going to give his amazing talk. Over to you, Tim. All right.
Well, thank you so much for having me on today, Peter, and thank you all out there for listening. So the starting point for my research, the opening of my book, The Republican House Divided, is one of the defining images of the January 6th Capitol insurrection in 2021. That is the image of an insurrectionist carrying a Confederate battle flag into the US Capitol. Considered in long historical context, the sight of a rioter carrying the Confederate flag to support a Republican president, the leader of the party of Lincoln, who's played a vital role in defeating the rebellious Southern states during the American Civil War, seems hard to credit. It is, however, wholly consistent with the contemporary GOP. And that is what I want to try and explain in my book. How and why did the Republican Party get from being the party of Abraham Lincoln, the political arm of the Union war effort during the Civil War of the 1860s, to being the comfortable home today of those who wave Confederate battle flags and defend Confederate monuments? And it's my contention the one potential answer lies in the political changes wrought during the Civil Rights era, with a particular focus on how Republicans engaged with the historical memories of the Civil War. Indeed, I argue that during the 1960s and 1970s, rival Republican factions utilized competing and contested Civil War memories as they fought intra-party battles over the GOP's positions on civil rights, African Americans, and the white South, and in their attempts to mobilize convicting voters. Ultimately, Republicans used Civil War memories instrumentally to support, oppose, and shape the GOP's transformation into a racially conservative party during the Civil Rights era. So in my book, The Republican House Divided, you can see it here for those of you watching, I assessed the relationships between Republicans and Civil War memory between roughly 1960 and the mid-1970s, a period covering the Civil War centennial, landmark moments in the civil rights struggle, a series of important presidential and midterm elections, and lots more. In my opening talk today, before Peter and I have a bit of a chat and have some questions, I want to run through some of my key findings about the Republican Party and Civil War memory in the 1960s and 1970s. So if we take the 1960 presidential election, I'm not going to get that in too much detail. I have written an article about it for Presidential Studies Quarterly, and there's plenty of coverage in the book. But for our purposes, the key points to grasp are that in 1960, the GOP was broadly united, both politically and in their engagement with Civil War memory. But that unanimity and consensus was shattered in the aftermath of Richard Nixon's narrow loss to the Democratic presidential nominee, John F. Kennedy. Indeed, after 1960, civil rights divided the GOP as it split the nation. And in the immediate aftermath of the party's 1960 reversal, the GOP was polarized between its progressive wing, associated with New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller and racially liberal republicanism, and the Republican right, which coalesced around Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Rockefeller and his allies contended that Nixon's error was in appealing to the South at the expense of the urban North. They called on the party to court black support and embrace civil rights. Conversely, Goldwater and his supporters criticized Nixon for prioritizing metropolitan voters ahead of conservative positions primed to win Southern converts. And so in the early 1960s, a crucial group in this story comes from below the Mason-Dixon line, from in the US South. In campaigns that threatened a century of Democratic dominance, Southern Republicans endeavored to boost their electoral chances, realign Southern politics, and transform the national GOP into a conservative organization attractive to white Southerners. Principally, they used Civil War memory to repudiate the GOP's negative image as the party of Northern aggression and radical Reconstruction, while also puncturing Southern Democrats' standing as the defenders of white supremacy and segregation. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on them, but themes around the Democratic Solid South, memories of Reconstruction, particularly negative memories of the Reconstruction era, feed into a white Southern hatred of the GOP, which Southern Republicans have to overcome in the Civil Rights era. Southern Republican candidates like William Wortman in South Carolina, James Martin in Alabama, Rubel Phillips in Mississippi invoked memories of the Civil War and Reconstruction to, on one hand, frame the GOP as an ally to white Southerners, stressing how far the party had changed since the 1860s and 1870s. Alongside this, they looked to puncture the standing of Southern Democrats as the surest defenders of segregation. And although all three would lose their elections, they put on strong showings. Phillips got 38% of the vote, Wortman 43%, Martin 49%. These solid showings in solidly Democratic states showed the potential of success for racially conservative republicanism and convinced national members of the GOP right that attracting white Southerners was no longer impossible. Now, within the national GOP right, the most influential conservative Republican was Barry Goldwater, who was a strident advocate of small government, fiscal conservatism, and states' rights. During the early 1960s, his supporters spent their time organizing at the Republican grassroots. A dedicated band of activists captured the GOP from the bottom up. They quietly filled the party's local and state level structures with Goldwater supporters, giving him a massive delegate lead before the 1964 race even started. GOP conservatives argued that Goldwater's states' rights conservatism would attract substantial white Southern support in 1964, with the Arizonans spending the early 60s flattering the sensibilities of Dixie reactionaries. While Goldwater was a hero to Republican conservatives, he was the bête noire of their intra-party rivals. Liberal Republicans, yes, liberal Republicans were once a thing. They resisted the GOP's racially conservative transformation determinedly, if ultimately unsuccessfully. They pressed fellow Republicans to align themselves with the civil rights movement rather than profit from white backlash against it. Progressives used Civil War memory as a key rhetorical prop to contest burgeoning Southern and Goldwaterite republicanism and articulate their alternative pro-civil rights vision. White and black progressive Republicans like Grant Reynolds or Nelson Rockefeller, in direct opposition to GOP conservatives, celebrated their party's Civil War heritage. They employed what I term a Republican emancipationist memory narrative, presenting the end of slavery under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln as the party's original mission, in order to champion a racially liberal present-day GOP aligned with the black freedom struggle. So we enter the 1964 election with the battle lines clearly drawn. Rockefeller and Goldwater, both declared candidates for the presidential nomination, offered wildly different visions for their party, especially in the field of civil rights. They and their supporters both sought to champion their politics and policies through the instrumental use of Civil War memory. Just as he'd done throughout the decade, Rockefeller, who was the governor of New York, presented himself and progressive republicanism as fully in step with the GOP's traditions, dating back to Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. He, at the same time, painted Goldwater as an aberration from the Republican Party's heritage, as an aberration of Lincoln, because mainly of his civil rights stances. While Rockefeller's campaign faltered, when it faltered, other progressive Republicans entered the fray, most notably Pennsylvania Governor William Scranton, who likewise framed themselves as in step with Lincoln, and Goldwater as out of step with the GOP's patron saint. But the Arizonan and his supporters did not take these charges lying down. Throughout 1964, Goldwater and Goldwaterites framed the senator and his conservative ideology as actually more consistent with Lincoln's views than those of GOP progressives. However, Goldwater was more strident in the use of Civil War memories in courting white Southern support, seeking to tap the pro-Confederate sentiments endemic in white Southern culture. Alongside memory nods, Goldwater also helped secure white Southern support by opposing and voting against the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Republicans arrived at the 1964 National Convention almost certain that Goldwater would win the nomination. GOP progressives tried to make a show of defiance, challenging the party's conservative platform, taking part in a major civil rights rally in the city, making defiant speeches during the convention, again frequently presenting Goldwater and his racial conservatism as disgracing the Republican heritage of Lincoln and the Civil War. It was all to no avail. Goldwater received 883 votes on the first ballot, more than enough to win the nomination comfortably. Unsurprisingly, Southern state delegations were firm supporters of Goldwater. After the convention, as progressives licked their wounds, Goldwater and his allies set off on the campaign trail trying to win the presidency. And in that, Civil War memory proved to be a key tool in Goldwater's rhetorical arsenal. In particular, Goldwater used historical references to promote his law and order platform. He used a speech in Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln's hometown and resting place, to rebuke the civil rights movement's perceived excesses. He berated those who, quote, seek redress to grievances through lawlessness, as he criticized an allegedly prevalent disregard for law and order. Declaring that he joined hands across the years with those Republicans who built our party, Goldwater claimed that his states' rights, law and order platform had transformed the GOP into the party of freedom once again, just as Lincoln helped make it a party of liberation during the Civil War. However, many of Goldwater's white Southern supporters used very different historical allusions to champion the GOP nominee and his platform. Rather than portraying Goldwater as Lincoln's legatee, his devoted backers instead framed him as a fitting heir to their Confederate ancestors. The party of our fathers is dead. Those who took its name are engaged in another reconstruction, this time not only of the South, but of the entire nation, declared South Carolina's Democratic Senator Strom Thurmond, as he announced in a mid-September televised address that he was switching parties and backing Goldwater. And Goldwater continued to reference the past most effectually as he pursued white Southern support. In appearances across the region, Goldwater venerated bygone white supremacist Democrats. On September 17th, the day after his party switch, Thurmond introduced Goldwater at a raucous rally in South Carolina. There is nothing left of the principles that your fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers stood for in the Democratic Party, Goldwater told the boisterous crowd, as they waved Confederate flags with gusto, here using historical memories to encourage white Southerners to renounce their generations-old partisan prejudices. On November 3rd, Goldwater was defeated comprehensively in the presidential election. Lyndon Johnson got the largest percentage of the popular vote ever till that stage. It was the biggest presidential landslide to date. But Goldwater succeeded where many predicted he would, in the Deep South, by carrying Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. And he did so extremely handsomely, 87% of the vote, staggeringly, in Mississippi, for instance. And this election was one of critical realignment. Many white Southerners, motivated by the two parties changing positions on civil rights, migrated to the GOP. By rupturing the Democratic Solid South, Goldwater reorientated the GOP toward racial conservatism and white Southerners. The future of Republican politics was forged in 1964. Despite his rout, Goldwater's campaign assured that the GOP's transformation into a racially conservative, Southern-focused party was marked, if not total. By tying the GOP to white backlash and Southern reactionaries, Goldwater and his supporters helped determine their party's relationship with racial politics for the rest of the 1960s and for decades to come. In the years after 1964, internal Republican debates were informed significantly by the intense discord occupying the US nation as a whole. The passage of the watershed 1965 Voting Rights Act resulted in a new phase in the Black freedom struggle. Many African-American organizations turned their gaze toward racial injustices above the Mason-Dixon line in the North. The advent of Black power was perceived by many onlookers as an increased militancy among civil rights activists. Police brutality and unequal living conditions fostered racial uprisings for successive summers, which in turn cemented the issue of Black lawlessness in the minds of many politicians and voters. The Civil War remained a key reference point as Republicans helped shape the nation's new racial politics, negotiating civil rights demands and the white backlash against them. Black Republicans were particularly vocal in the wake of the party's 1964 reversal. Although the overwhelming majority of African Americans identified as Democrats, this small remaining band of Black partisans was determined to instill its own version of pro-civil rights republicanism. Black Republicans utilized civil war memories extensively in their efforts to foster a racially liberal post-Cold War GOP, expressing authentic connections with their party's 19th century traditions. Some progressive white Republicans, like Nelson Rockefeller, joined Black Republicans in calling for a racially liberal GOP, which could, they argued, live up to Lincoln's mantle. Yet it should be noted that some Black Republican activists became skeptical about such laudatory Lincolnian references, believing these appeals did little to heal the breach with African American voters caused by Goldwaterism. At the same time, many Southern Republicans took heart from Goldwater's success with white Southerners. Figures such as Strom Thurmond and Albert Watson, both Democrat to Republican switches in South Carolina, used lost cause pro-Confederate sentiments in their efforts to cement the region's realignment. Yet other Southern Republicans, notably Rubel Phillips in Mississippi, toned down their rhetoric, seeing the need to moderate their politics and their engagement with civil memory after the 1965 Voting Rights Act began fostering an integrated Southern electorate. Another politician who altered his political appeals and resultant engagement with historical memories was Richard Nixon. Goldwater's decisive defeat offered the former vice president a route back to party leadership. Nixon restyled Republican racial conservatism. He aimed to expand beyond Goldwater's southern base by harnessing national white resentment about urban rebellions and Black power, alongside campus radicalism and anti-war protests. Ever the pragmatist, Nixon adapted his Civil War memory usages as he advanced his more right-wing platform and inserted himself as the front runner for the 1968 GOP nomination. In addition to appearing in all 11 former Confederate states to woo white Southern support, Nixon also embraced law and order rhetoric during this period. These appeals served as coded language to win votes from white Northerners and Southerners who were uneasy about civil rights, urban unrest, and changing social mores, but without straying over into expressing blatant racial prejudice. Unlike progressives who cited Lincoln to promote racially liberal republicanism, Nixon invoked the 16th president to cast himself as a law and order champion. Writing in Reader's Digest, for instance, Nixon railed against not only a growing tolerance of lawlessness, but an increasing public acceptance of civil disobedience. There can be no right to revolt in this society, no right to demonstrate outside the law, Nixon concluded. And in Lincoln's words, no grievance that is a fit object of redress by mob law. Thanks to his activism in the aftermath of 1964, his long-standing ties to party operatives, and the divided nature of the divided nature of the GOP, Nixon was the frontrunner for the Republican nomination in 1968. An election which took place in a social and political maelstrom of anti-war protests, campus unrest, political assassinations, and continued racial tensions. In that context, Nixon's message of law and order resonated with figures inside and outside the Republican Party. Rockefeller belatedly entered the nomination race after Martin Luther King's assassination, making a final and defiant but unsuccessful charge behind the banner of progressive republicanism. Some on the GOP right mooted California Governor Ronald Reagan as a presidential nominee. Wonder whatever happened to him. But there was never any real threat to Nixon's ascent in 1968. And he sought the presidency on a conservative platform tied intimately to racial issues. He continued using Lincolnian memories, encoded appeals to white voters who felt alienated from racial and generational changes. Nixon pronounced his determination to restore law and order, pitting ostensibly law-abiding white citizens, who he would later dub the silent majority, against civil rights radicals, urban rioters, student leftists, and anti-war protesters. Appearing in Chicago in early September, soon after the tumultuous Democratic National Convention, he juxtaposed his firm anti-crime positions with the disorderly protests and disarrayed Democrats. This is a nation of laws, Nixon declared, and as Abraham Lincoln has said, no one is above the law, no one is below the law, and we're going to enforce the law, and Americans should remember that if we're going to have law and order. In many respects, the divided nature of 1968 America produced a highly divided political picture. Alongside Nixon, there was also Democrat nominee Hubert Humphrey, LBJ's vice president, hampered by association with an unpopular president and an unpopular war in Vietnam, as well as third-party independent George Wallace. While having some purchase outside the former Confederacy, the former Alabama Governor Wallace was very much a last gasp of defiance from Southern segregationists, one that forced or maybe enabled Nixon and the Republicans to moderate their appeals in the South, where they largely dropped, if only temporarily, the pro-Confederate references that had come to define Southern Republicanism. Ultimately, Nixon would win the presidency in 1968. Wallace did triumph extensively in the Deep South, but Nixon held South Carolina, mainly thanks to strong Thurman support. And strenuous campaigning by Thurman and Nixon's running mate Spiro Agnew also helped Nixon carry the southern states of Florida, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. So for the first time since JFK's inauguration in 1961, the US had a Republican in the White House. And it's my contention that the GOP remained on a racially conservative trajectory during the Nixon years, thanks to the actions of the administration and wider party actors, and that the Civil War memory endured as a crucial contested element of intra-party battles as rival Republicans both furthered and resisted this course. While GOP campaigns in the region have predominantly lost the segregationist and unreconstructed tenor of the early 1960s, historical memories remain symbolically and practically useful for Southern Republicans. GOP partisans understood that some white Southerners still remained hesitant about the party of Lincoln and Reconstruction, especially at a more state and local level. They therefore referenced the Civil War era to again reassure doubters that their party, just like the once beloved Democratic Party, had changed in the last century. Most pushed voters to embrace the future in the place of a hostile past, relying on apparent moderation and coded language rather than openly racialized appeals. Yet other Southern Republicans remain willing to rely on more racially explicit appeals to the Confederacy and Reconstruction in their campaign efforts. Concurrent with Southern Republicans utilizing Civil War era allusions in their political strategies, national GOP leaders likewise perceived emotionally charged historical references as a key instrument to support their own ambitions. Although abjuring overt racism in favor of coded conservatism, Nixon unambiguously tailored policy decisions and presidential rhetoric to advance a Southern strategy. Civil War references were a key part of Nixon and Agnew's rhetorical Southern strategy. During the 1960s, Southern Republicans themselves had been the principal employers of Confederate memories. Although the National Party had sometimes taken advantage of such lost cause sentiments, the language originated from Southern Republicans themselves. Ensconced in the White House, Nixon and Agnew embraced heartily the pro-Confederate language long used by Southern Republicans. And the apogee of this lost cause usage was Agnew's May 1970 appearance at Stone Mountain, Georgia. There he spoke at the dedication of massive stone reliefs of Robert E. Lee, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis, three icons of the Confederacy. The monument had been a dream of heritage groups for decades, was highly controversial, given that the Second Ku Klux Klan had been founded at Stone Mountain in 1915 in the aftermath of D.W. Griffith's film, The Birth of a Nation. In his speech in 1970, Agnew celebrated the Confederate luminaries' loyalty, dignity, and honor. He repeated common lost cause myths, including the claim that Robert E. Lee had opposed slavery and secession, and depicted this secessionist trio as model Americans. Any reconciliationist nods he did call on Americans to set aside the evils of sectionalism once and for all were drowned out by his full-throated praise of Lee, Jackson, and Davis. And he even left time for a false equivalency, appealing to white Southern victimhood by saying, just as the South cannot afford to discriminate against any of its own people, the rest of the nation cannot afford to discriminate against the South. Now, there was, of course, other figures at play in the Republican Party during the Nixon years. In my book, I lay out a shift in black republicanism, with pro-Nixon right-wing African-Americans reimagining Civil War memory to champion the president's conservative civil rights policies. I also note that there was a defiant band of progressive Republicans opposed to Nixon, who, continuing their efforts from the 1960s, relied on historical references to champion pro-civil rights republicanism. However, these progressives dwindled in influence. Indeed, the idea of liberal or progressive Republicans today is somewhat ridiculous, and they could not sway the racially conservative tide of their party. If folks want to know more, I guess you're going to have to buy the book, I'm afraid. So to draw my pre-prepared remarks to a close, my research concludes that during the 1960s and 1970s, right-wing Republicans transformed the GOP into a racially conservative party that was overwhelmingly white, increasingly Southern, and increasingly reliant on anti-black resentment on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. Yet their success was not inevitable. Republicans of all stripes used Civil War memories as key political tools to support, oppose, and ultimately shape this transformation. Rival Republicans, as they battled over the GOP's strategies towards civil rights, African Americans, and the white South, employed Civil War memory to fight intra-party battles and sell competing visions of republicanism to their party and nation. Politicians, GOP activists, and ordinary Americans sought usable pasts and viewed historical memories as valuable instruments of politics. The GOP became the party of Lincoln and Lee in the civil rights era. Progressives and conservatives both invoke Lincoln's plastic memory, perceiving political value in getting right with their party's patron saint and hoping to justify their rival positions by claiming his mantle. Simultaneously, Southern Republicans expanded their use of Confederate memories. Southern and conservative Republicans, including National Party leaders, made common cause with the Lost Cause to realign the South and attract reactionary voters nationwide. The path from the civil rights era republicanism to the contemporary party of Donald Trump is complex, but I will contend the intra-party conflicts and partisan changes of the 1960s and 70s GOP helped forge the conditions which ultimately enabled an insurrectionist to carry a Confederate battle flag into the US Capitol on January 6, 2021, in support of a Republican president without any concern for historical contradiction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. That was absolutely amazing. To be honest, I could have listened to that for carried on. It was so interesting. Two things that really struck in my mind was obviously the context that was mentioned there before about how I'm doing Black Lives Matter and stuff. So this is very relevant to like stuff that's going on even today. Do you know what I mean? But also, like, I'm a big fan of like superheroes and stuff. And one of the things I always watch is like what if, like a what if scenario type of thing. And one of the things you brought up there was like Reagan threw his hat in the line in 1968. What if he had to get in then instead of when he actually did, you know what I mean? But in regards to like questions for you today, Tim. Oh, and I must mention as well, folks, if you're interested in Tim's book, Dr. Galsworthy's book, it'll be the cover of this YouTube video. As you see, the title and all will be there. Go back to the start as well if you want to figure out the book as well. But yeah, it seems like a very interesting read. Spicy, if you can tell by the talk here. But regarding the questions today, Tim, what got you interested in this specific area of history?
I mean, there's a long and a short story. So the long story is that, and I preface this by saying I went to a very, very normal state school in the northwest of England. But my very normal state school was twinned with a school on Martha's Vineyard. So I got to go to Martha's Vineyard for 2 weeks in high school, and we did some trips to Boston. And so I kind of fell in love a bit with Americana there. And then I went back to Boston with my parents a few years later, found out about the Massachusetts 54th, was an all-black regiment in the Civil War. And then I just got really interested in Civil War history. So I did some Civil War courses as an undergraduate. But from that, I realized actually I'm more interested in the memory. I'm more interested in these questions around how politicians have used it in the particularly in the civil rights era, and questions around monuments. So that's kind of the longest story of how I got to the general topic. But this topic specifically, Trump was elected for the first time on my birthday while I was doing my master's, which felt like a bit of a sign from the universe about, you know, I was at that time I was doing my master's thesis on kind of Civil War memory and civil rights era politics, and it got me to thinking, you know, and then over the year later we had Charlottesville, and it just felt like Civil War memory and the Republican Party was everywhere in the public mind, but there was no real understanding of how did we get there. It was just taken as a given. Well, yeah, Republicans defend Confederate monuments, or Republicans wave the Confederate flag, and peeling it back, that doesn't make sense in long historical context. So that was the basis of my PhD, to try and understand how do we get there. I think it is to do with the major political transformations and civil rights revolution of the 1960s and 70s. And that PhD thesis ultimately grew into the book. And, you know, January 6th happened while I was doing the PhD, and that image of the guy with the Confederate battle flag in the Capitol, Charles Sumner, abolitionist Republican on one side, John C. Calhoun, pro-slavery advocate on the other. It just felt like it captured everything of, well, how did we get here? How did we get to that moment? So that's how I got into the book, and that's what the book's trying to explain. Why is it taken as a given that the Confederate flag and Confederate monuments are associated with the Republican Party? Because that doesn't make sense when you go back to 1865 and the Civil War itself. It doesn't make sense.
So as you see, folks, it's definitely worth a read. Very contemporary topics, but also I'm a historian, and I'm sure there's many historians watching and listening to this. But just for a general read, it does seem absolutely amazing. So definitely check out Tim's book. And also building on from that, Tim, is there any other areas like associated with this, or maybe elsewhere? Maybe it's a completely different topic that you're interested in researching, or potentially that you feel needs researched or looked at?
I mean, a bit that comes through in the book quite a lot is how kind of Democrats respond to Republican uses of civil memory. I spend a lot of time talking about Southern Republicans, so kind of Southern Democrats come into that. And the 60s and the 70s is a really important moment for the Democratic Party in the South. You know, it's long been associated with segregation in the South. How does that change? So I think more research on Southern Democrats using civil memory. There's bits, you know, headline figures like Ross Barnett, George Wallace, but I think more needs to be done on a state level. In terms of kind of where my research is going next, I'm kind of staying in a similar area. I'm starting to look at Dwight Eisenhower a bit more, Eisenhower's relationship with civil memory, and Eisenhower's relationship with Southern Republicanism, because he does appear in the book. I mean, that was one of the things that for PhD listeners out there, or ex-PhD listeners out there, it came up in my Viva, kind of my external supervisor, my external examiner said, well, where's Eisenhower in this? So that was something I tried to work on into the book. But as I was doing that, I realized there was a sort of another line I wanted to go down about how responsible is Eisenhower for this emergence of Southern Republicanism, and what is Eisenhower's relationship with Civil War memory, because I think that hasn't been touched on too much. And that is research. I've been to the Eisenhower Library. That's the articles I'm currently working on at the moment.
And I think historical memory in general is like a topic that's emerging even more so.
Yeah, definitely.
I know, like, in terms of like the Irish Revolutionary period here, there's big debates going on around historical memory and stuff. So it's interesting how you're bringing in, not only through your own research you've currently done, but how Eisenhower and all can adapt to it. So it's super interesting. But yeah, Tim, I just wanted to thank you very much for being with us today. And as I say, folks, for any other historians, scholars of any disciplines, get in touch with me. I'll definitely have you on. And as I say, Tim's book, as he just showed there, if you want to check it out, it should be an amazing read. I'll have it in the description of the video as well. It'll also be on the front for like the thumbnail for this video. But yeah, It's a fantastic read, and I'm sure you're all the same as me, folks. Can't thank Tim enough for his fantastic work today, and sharing his research. It's absolutely amazing. But without any further ado, folks, I hope you all do well. I hope you enjoy your week, and stay tuned for much more talking history on the next episodes to come. See you all soon. Bye bye.